All right, so today we're diving deep into a place that sounds straight out of an adventure novel,
Oh, really? Where are we headed?
the Wakhan Corridor. It's this narrow strip of land in Afghanistan tucked between these huge mountains, and it actually connects to China.
Wow, so remote. Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's like a time capsule, but also a real hotbed for all this geopolitical intrigue.
Ah, I see.
Mm.
So, why should our listeners care about this walk-on corridor?
Well, if you're into geography or history, this one's for you. And honestly, anyone prepping for like the UPSC exam, where knowing these global hotspots is key, this is going to be super helpful.
Right, because in the UPSC exam, they could ask anything about the walk-on corridor, its history, its relevance today.
Exactly. So to guide us through this, we've got some excerpts from a recent article about it.
Okay, let's hear it.
All right, so picture this. A strip of land, just 13 kilometers wide at its narrowest, winding through the mountains of Afghanistan. They call it Afghanistan's chicken neck sometimes.
Chicken neck. Okay, I'm picturing it. Why do they call it that?
Well, it connects Afghanistan to China's Xinjiang region,
Yeah.
but it's sandwiched between Tajikistan to the north and Pakistan to the south. So,
Yeah.
super strategic.
Ah, I see. The chicken neck
Yeah.
makes sense.
And, the story of how it even came to be is a wild one. Yeah,
Oh.
back in the 19th century, you had this great game going on. Basically, the British and Russian empires, big rivals, right?
Oh, yeah, those were some tense times.
Totally. So they carved out the Wakhan Corridor as like a buffer zone to, prevent them from clashing directly.
So this place born out of conflict is now, what, a potential flashpoint?
It's crazy, right? History repeating itself in a way. But there's a new player in the mix now, China.
Ah, yes. The article mentioned their growing interest in the Wakhan Corridor, especially with the Taliban back in control in Afghanistan.
Exactly. So what do you think is driving China's interest there?
Well, it's got to do with China's Belt and Road Initiative, right? That modern-day Silk Road they're building.
Right, that huge network of infrastructure and trade routes they have going.
And the Wakhan Corridor is looking more and more tempting to them. They even talked about extending their China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, that CPEC thing, right through the Wakhan.
Oh, yeah, the CPEC, part of the Belt and Road.
Right, and if that happens, China's got a direct link to all those resource-rich Central Asian countries.
So it's not just about trade, it's also about getting those resources.
Yeah.
I remember reading that China's been trying to get land from Tajikistan, too, and there's even whispers of some military presence near the Wakhan.
Or for sure, back in 2011, Tajikistan gave China a big chunk of land in the Pamir Mountains, and people were definitely raising their eyebrows at that. And then there's been these unconfirmed reports about Chinese military stuff happening on the Tajik side of the Wakhan.
Wow, so they're really positioning themselves.
It seems that way, but the question is why, right? What's their game?
Well, the article threw out a few ideas. I mean, on the one hand, it makes sense economically, right? Securing access to resources that'll keep their economy booming.
Totally, all the oil, natural gas, minerals, that kind of thing.
Right. But then there's the security angle, too. They're worried about things like, the drug trade and instability in Afghanistan spilling over into their Xinjiang province, which, shares a tiny border with the Wakhan.
Right, because they've been dealing with those separatist movements and what they see as extremism in Xinjiang for ages, and having a foothold in the Wakhan corridor could help them, control the border and keep an eye on potential threats.
It's like they're trying to project power to protect their own interests.
Absolutely, but there's also that historical angle to consider. Remember the Silk Road, connecting east and west through this very region.
Yeah, it's almost like they're reviving that historical connection.
Right, and for China, tapping into that narrative is pretty powerful. It feeds into this whole idea of them reclaiming their place as a global power.
It's a fascinating mix of economic motives, security concerns, and a touch of historical ambition. And at the center of it all is this seemingly forgotten Wakhan corridor, suddenly thrust onto the world stage.
Yeah, it just goes to show you how fast things can change in geopolitics.
Mhm.
But hold on, we've got to remember, it's not just China eyeing the Wakhan corridor. Pakistan's getting interested too, right?
Oh, absolutely. And then there's Afghanistan itself.
Right in the middle of it all, yeah. And, Pakistan's interest is kind of different from China's. They've been looking for ways to get into Central Asia for a while now, but,
Mm-hmm.
their relationship with Afghanistan hasn't always been, let's say, the best.
Yeah, that's right. The article said the Wakhan corridor could be like a way for them to just completely bypass Afghanistan and set up direct trade with those Central Asian countries.
Exactly. Why go through all the hassle if you can just go around right?
Right. Makes sense.
And think about it, this route opens up all these new markets for Pakistani goods, and it could mean they're not so reliant on the, traditional trade routes, which can be a bit politically tricky, to say the least.
Yeah, definitely. So in a way, Pakistan and China's interests kind of line up here, right? They both see the Wakhan Corridor as this strategic way to, expand their reach.
True, but there's a catch. Pakistan doesn't want to be too reliant on China either. They want to keep some independence, some leverage. So it's a real balancing act, working with China sometimes, but also doing their own thing.
It's like walking a geopolitical tightrope. Everyone's trying to grab their piece while also navigating this web of, relationships.
Exactly, you got it. And speaking of navigating complexities, let's not forget about the most important player here, Afghanistan.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? You have this relatively small country that's landlocked, but it controls this super strategically important piece of land that, well, everyone wants a piece of, like David and Goliath.
It really is. And just like David, Afghanistan has, been resilient throughout history, fought off invaders left and right. But defending the Wakhan Corridor, that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, the article talked about how remote it is, how few people actually live there. It's got to be almost impossible to control effectively.
It's a logistical nightmare. Patrolling and securing a place like that, especially with the resources Afghanistan has. And then there's, the question of stability within Afghanistan itself. Can their government, with all the stuff they're dealing with, can they really manage this, this important corridor?
That's a good point. It makes me wonder, with all these powerful players kind of, circling, isn't there a real chance the Wakhan Corridor could become like a flashpoint, a place where conflict actually breaks out?
It's a valid concern, for sure. Remember, Afghanistan's been called the graveyard of empires for a reason.
Right.
They've been really good at repelling invaders. But this new great game, it's not about just conquering anymore. It's more about, like, subtle competition for influence and control.
So instead of tanks and troops, we're talking economics, partnerships, maybe even some information warfare.
Exactly. Yeah. And that makes it way harder to predict what's going to happen. We can't just look at troop movements anymore. We have to look deeper at the money, the diplomacy, the stories each side is telling.
Yeah, and for anyone studying for the UPSC exam, that's where it gets really interesting. Understanding these subtle things, why each player is doing what they're doing, what could happen next, it's crucial for understanding the bigger picture of geopolitics. It's not enough to just know where the Wakhan Corridor is on a map. You have to get what it represents.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The Wakhan Corridor, it's like a miniature version of all the challenges and opportunities we're facing globally in the 21st century. Globalization, regional rivalries, the whole struggle for power.
So as we kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are the main things our listeners should remember, especially if they're just learning about the Wakhan Corridor now?
Well, the biggest thing is location, location, location. The Wakhan Corridor is a perfect example of how geography and politics are tied together. Its location makes it super valuable to different countries, each with their own goals.
It also shows that international relations today, they're messy. There's no easy answers. And understanding these relationships means you have to look beyond the surface, What's driving each player? What are their strategies? It's like a super complicated game of chess.
Okay, so we've talked about how complicated this all is, who the players are, what's at stake. But the big question is, what's next for the Wakhan Corridor? Will it be a place where countries work together or a place where they clash?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? No one can predict the future for sure, but we can, look at everything that's happening and try to imagine some possibilities.
All right, let's do that. Let's say, best case scenario, the Wakhan Corridor does become this bridge for cooperation. What would that even look like?
Well, you could imagine China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and maybe even some other countries in the area all working together,
Right.
developing the infrastructure, boosting trade, making life better for the people who live there. Okay, so everyone wins. More connections bring economic benefits and reduce tensions. But honestly, do you really think that kind of cooperation is possible,
Yeah.
given all the rivalry and mistrust?
It would be a tough one, for sure. To make that happen, we'd need like a huge shift in how things work in the region. Countries would have to put shared goals ahead of their own ambitions. There would have to be a ton of trust building, compromise, and diplomacy.
And that hasn't exactly been the norm in that part of the world, has it? So what if things don't go that way? What are some of the, let's say, not so optimistic scenarios?
Well, the flip side is, the Wakhan Corridor could become this flashpoint, a place where conflict actually erupts. Imagine if the competition for influence just keeps heating up and no one trusts each other. You could see the whole region becoming unstable, proxy wars breaking out, political maneuvering, maybe even military threats, and that would be bad news, not just for the countries right there, but for the whole area.
Yeah, especially for Afghanistan, which is already dealing with a lot of internal issues. To pile on even more instability would be rough.
Absolutely. A destabilized Wakhan corridor would be a nightmare for Afghanistan, and it could easily spill over into the neighboring countries, making an already tense situation even worse.
Okay, so we've got cooperation on one end, conflict on the other. Is there like a middle ground here? Something in between that's maybe more likely?
There is one possibility that seems pretty plausible. A scenario of, I'd call it limited engagement. Basically, the big powers take a more cautious approach. They each try to secure their own interests, but without doing anything too dramatic that would, set everyone off.
So kind of like a stalemate. The Wakhan Corridor doesn't really develop that much, but it's relatively peaceful.
Yeah, exactly. The potential of the walk-on corridor, well, it doesn't really get tapped into, but at least there's no huge war. It's not perfect, but it could be the most likely outcome, at least for now.
It's a lot to think about. And for our listeners, especially those getting ready for exams like the UPSC, the Wakhan Corridor is a perfect example of why it's so important to think critically, to connect the dots.
I agree. It's not about just memorizing stuff. It's about understanding the forces that are shaping the world, the history, the economic interests, the security concerns, and how they all come together in a place like the Wakhan Corridor.
So to wrap things up, what are the big takeaways from our deep dive today?
Well, first, the Wakhan Corridor is a great example of how geography influences geopolitics. Even the most remote places can become important because of where they are and what resources they might have.
And second, it shows how complicated international relations are today. It's not just about simple alliances or who has the biggest army anymore. It's much more nuanced, much more interconnected. It's about economics, security, history.
It's a lot to grasp, but that's what makes it so interesting. And speaking of interesting, we want to hear from you. What do you think about the future of the Wakhan Corridor? Cooperation, conflict, something else? Let us know in the comments.
And while you're there, hit that subscribe button and share this episode with anyone who might enjoy this deep dive. The more we all understand these issues, the better we can deal with the challenges and opportunities in our world.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Wakhan Corridor. We'll be back soon with another fascinating exploration. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those brains working.